The leather portfolio trembled in my hands as his laughter sliced through the executive conference room like shattered glass. "Oh wait, you're just a secretary, right?" Mason Stone said, his voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from a lifetime of inherited privilege. "I thought maybe you were lost or trying to give me legal advice." The 8 board members around the mahogany table chuckled along, their eyes sliding past me like I was office furniture. "Stick to filing papers, sweetheart," he continued, waving his hand dismissively. "Leave the real business decisions to those of us who actually own something." I stood there in my navy blazer and pencil skirt, holding those heavy legal documents, watching him lean back in his chair with that satisfied smirk that told me he'd just won something. In his world, I was invisible, forgettable, nothing. He had no idea he just declared war on the woman who held his entire financial future in her hands, and the power to destroy it with a single signature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 52nd floor, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors of Stone Industries headquarters in downtown Millbrook Heights. The executive conference room, with its intimidating mahogany table that could seat 20 but today held only 8 of the company's most powerful board members, felt more like a courtroom than a business meeting. The air conditioning hummed quietly, unable to mask the tension that had been building for the past hour. I had been working at Stone Industries for 3 years, long enough to know that quarterly board meetings were sacred territory. As the executive assistant to the chief legal officer, I typically stayed in my adjacent office, handling the endless stream of calls and emails that kept the legal department running smoothly. But today was different. Today, I was delivering documents that could change everything, though none of the people in that room understood their true significance. Mason Stone sat at the head of the table like he owned it, which technically his family did. At 28, he'd been handed a vice president title in strategic development, a position that came with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and the kind of unearned confidence that only generational wealth can provide. His perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning light, and his tailored Armani suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about him screamed privilege, from his Swiss watch, to his Italian leather shoes, to the casual way he dismissed anyone he deemed beneath his social station. "As I was saying," Mason continued, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd never been told no, "the acquisition of Hartwell Manufacturing needs to move forward immediately. My father may be hesitant, but I've been analyzing their market position, and waiting another quarter would be a strategic error." Board member Patricia Blackwood, a woman in her 60s who'd climbed her way to the top of the financial world through sheer determination, nodded thoughtfully. "The numbers you've presented are compelling, Mason, but have we considered the regulatory implications? The antitrust concerns alone could delay this for months." "Which is exactly why we need to move now," Mason replied, leaning forward with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that comes from someone who's never faced real consequences, "before the regulators catch up to what we're doing." That's when I knocked on the heavy oak door and entered, carrying the leather portfolio that contained documents I'd been instructed to deliver immediately. The conversation stopped as 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me, though most looked through me rather than at me. In their world, I was part of the infrastructure, as essential as the coffee machine, but just as invisible when it came to actual decision-making. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice professional and measured. "I have the updated fiduciary documentation from the legal department. Mr. Blackstone requested these be delivered immediately for review." I approached the table, acutely aware of my navy blazer and pencil skirt, my sensible heels clicking against the marble floor. My appearance was carefully calculated, professional enough to command respect, conservative enough to avoid unwanted attention, polished enough to blend seamlessly into the corporate environment. I'd learned early in my career that the right clothing could make you nearly invisible while still maintaining access to the corridors of power. Mason barely glanced up from his presentation materials. "Just leave them on the side table," he said dismissively, waving his hand like he was shooing away a fly. "We're in the middle of something important here." "Actually," I said, maintaining my professional tone, "these documents require immediate attention. They pertain to the Stone family trust restructuring, and there are time-sensitive signatures required before the end of business today." That's when Mason's head snapped up, his blue eyes focusing on me for the first time. But instead of the concern or interest that trust fund documents should have generated, his expression shifted to something darker, amusement mixed with condescension. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "but who exactly are you to be commenting on Stone family trust matters?" He looked around the table, ensuring he had his audience's attention before delivering his next line. "Oh wait, you're just a secretary, right?" The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Not the hearty laughter of genuine amusement, but the uncomfortable chuckling of people who recognize cruelty but lack the courage to confront it. Patricia Blackwood looked down at her papers. Senior Vice President James Lewis suddenly found his phone fascinating. Even Thomas Wright, the company's longest-serving board member, shifted uncomfortably in his chair but said nothing. "I thought maybe you were lost," Mason continued, his confidence growing with each word, "or trying to give me legal advice." More uncomfortable laughter rippled around the table. "Stick to filing papers, sweetheart. Leave the real business decisions to those of us who actually own something." I stood there, holding that leather portfolio, feeling the weight of every document inside it. Documents that these people couldn't begin to understand the importance of. Mason leaned back in his chair, that satisfied smirk spreading across his face like he'd just won some sort of victory. In his mind, he'd just put an uppity secretary in her place, reinforced the hierarchy that kept him at the top, and entertained his father's business associates with a display of casual dominance. But as I looked at him, sitting there in his expensive suit with his inherited title and his unearned confidence, I felt something crystallize inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with inevitability. He had no idea what he'd just done, no idea who he was talking to, no idea that the woman he'd just dismissed as just a secretary held documents that could unravel his entire privileged existence with nothing more than a phone call and the right signatures. "Of course, Mr. Stone," I said quietly, my voice never losing its professional composure. "I'll make sure these documents reach the appropriate parties for proper handling." I turned and walked toward the door, my heels clicking with the same measured rhythm as when I'd entered. Behind me, I could hear Mason resuming his presentation about the Hartwell acquisition, his voice full of renewed confidence and self-satisfaction. The board members settled back into their seats, the uncomfortable moment already fading from their memories like a minor embarrassment they preferred to forget. But as I reached for the door handle, I allowed myself one small smile. Mason Stone had just declared war on the wrong person, and he didn't even know it yet. The documents in my portfolio weren't just trust fund paperwork, they were the keys to his entire financial future, documents that detailed every cent of his inheritance, every condition of his trust fund, every legal requirement he needed to meet to maintain his wealthy lifestyle. And thanks to a carefully orchestrated series of legal maneuvers that had taken me 3 years to arrange, I wasn't just delivering these documents, I was the one with the power to authorize them. My name is Evie Hall. And before I dive deeper into exactly how I managed to position myself with that kind of legal authority over a multi-million-dollar trust fund, I need you to do something for me. Could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? I want to know where my story is reaching, because what I'm about to share with you changed not just my life but the entire trajectory of one of the most powerful families in Millbrook Heights. And please, if this story moves you at all, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who think they're better than you, hit that like button right now, subscribe to my channel and ring that notification bell, because there's so much more I need to tell you about what happens when someone who's been underestimated for years finally decides to use the power they've been quietly accumulating. You see, when Mason Stone called me just a secretary in front of that entire board of directors, he made the same mistake that powerful people have been making for centuries. He assumed that job titles tell the whole story. He assumed that because I wore a modest blazer instead of a designer suit, because I carried documents instead of commanding meetings, because I spoke quietly instead of dominating conversations, that meant I was powerless. But here's what Mason didn't know, what none of them knew as they sat around that mahogany table making jokes at my expense. I wasn't just Evie Hall, executive assistant to the chief legal officer. I was Evie Hall, licensed attorney, certified estate planner, and most importantly, the granddaughter of Margaret Hall, the woman who had written the original Stone family trust documents 43 years ago. Let me paint you a picture of how we got here, because this story didn't start that morning in the conference room. It started 3 years earlier, when I made a decision that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I graduated from Northwestern Law School with honors, top 15% of my class, with specializations in estate planning and corporate law. I had job offers from 3 prestigious law firms in Chicago, starting salaries that would have paid off my student loans within 5 years, and a clear path to partnership if I worked the 100-hour weeks and played the political games that big law demands. But I had something more valuable than career ambition. I had information. You see, my grandmother Margaret had been more than just a lawyer. She'd been a pioneer, one of the first women to establish her own estate planning practice in Millbrook Heights back in the 1980s. She'd built her reputation working with wealthy families who needed discretion, expertise, and absolute confidentiality. The Stone family had been her biggest client, trusting her with their most sensitive financial arrangements for over 2 decades. When my grandmother passed away 5 years ago, she left me more than just memories and family photos. She left me her files, meticulously organized records of every legal document she'd ever created, every trust she'd structured, every family secret she'd been sworn to protect, and buried in those files were the complete records of the Stone family trust, including some very interesting clauses that had been written into the original documents at the specific request of Mason's grandfather. The old man had been worried about raising entitled children and grandchildren. He'd built Stone Industries from nothing, working 16-hour days and sacrificing everything for success, and he was terrified that his wealth would create spoiled, incompetent heirs who would destroy everything he'd built. So he'd asked my grandmother to include very specific provisions in the trust, provisions that would ensure his descendants had to earn their inheritance through demonstrated competence, ethical behavior, and respect for others. But here's where it gets interesting. The trust documents included a clause that gave the original attorney's legal successor the authority to monitor compliance with these behavioral requirements, and if necessary to invoke what was called the competency review process. If the heir demonstrated a pattern of unprofessional conduct, unethical behavior, or what the documents specifically termed conduct unbecoming of a Stone family representative, the trust could be suspended pending a full review by an independent panel. My grandmother had retired before these clauses ever needed to be used. Mason's father had been respectful, hard-working, and generally decent in his business dealings, but Mason himself had always been different. Entitled, cruel, careless with other people's feelings and livelihoods. My grandmother had mentioned him occasionally during our conversations, always with a certain sad expression that suggested she knew trouble was coming. When she passed away, I inherited not just her files but her legal responsibilities as successor counsel to the Stone family trust. It was a position that existed in the legal documents but had never been activated. The Stone family lawyers had no idea it existed because it was buried in subsection 47C of a document that was over 100 pages long, and frankly, they'd never bothered to read the entire thing. So when I applied for the executive assistant position at Stone Industries 3 years ago, I wasn't looking for a career. I was positioning myself for something much more strategic. I needed to observe Mason Stone firsthand, to document his behavior, to build an ironclad case for why the competency review process should be invoked. And let me tell you, Mason made it incredibly easy. Over the past 3 years, I've watched him humiliate employees, make decisions based on ego rather than business sense, treat support staff like they're subhuman, and generally conduct himself like someone who believes rules don't apply to him. I've documented every incident, every cruel comment, every example of the kind of behavior his grandfather specifically wrote the trust clauses to prevent. But I needed more than just observations. I needed witnesses, documentation, and most importantly, I needed the perfect moment to activate the legal mechanisms that my grandmother had so carefully constructed decades ago. That moment came this morning when Mason decided to humiliate me in front of 8 board members who could serve as witnesses to his conduct. When he called me just a secretary and told me to stick to filing papers, he crossed a line that had been drawn in legal documents before he was even born. The leather portfolio I was carrying didn't just contain trust documents, it contained the formal notification of competency review proceedings, documents that would freeze his access to trust funds pending a full investigation into his fitness to represent the Stone family legacy. But here's what makes this story even more satisfying. The competency review process doesn't just affect Mason, it affects everyone who's enabled his behavior, everyone who's profited from his family's wealth while turning a blind eye to his cruelty. The review process includes provisions for examining the entire corporate structure, the board composition, and the company's treatment of employees at every level. So when I walked out of that conference room with Mason's laughter still echoing behind me, I wasn't just a humiliated secretary planning revenge. I was a licensed attorney with 43 years of legal precedent behind me, armed with the tools to dismantle an empire of entitlement piece by carefully documented peace. And the beautiful thing is, Mason still has no idea what's coming. None of them do. But you're about to find out exactly how 3 years of careful planning and a lifetime of underestimation can combine to create the kind of justice that money can't buy and privilege can't protect against. Are you ready to see what happens when someone finally reads the fine print? To understand how we got to that moment in the conference room, I need to take you back to where it all began. Not 3 years ago when I started working at Stone Industries, but 5 years ago in my grandmother's modest law office on Elm Street, surrounded by boxes of files that would change my entire life's trajectory. Margaret Hall had built her practice the old-fashioned way, one client at a time, one meticulously crafted document at a time, one family secret at a time. Her office wasn't glamorous like the glass towers downtown. It was a converted Victorian house with creaky wooden floors, tall windows that let in afternoon light, and walls lined with law books that she'd actually read cover to cover. But what her office lacked in modern polish, it made up for in something far more valuable: trust. The wealthy families of Millbrook Heights had learned over the decades that Margaret Hall was the woman you called when you needed absolute discretion, flawless legal work, and the kind of moral backbone that money couldn't buy. She'd guided 3 generations through divorces, mergers, estate planning, and family crises that would have destroyed reputations if they'd ever become public. The Stone family had been her crown jewel client, but also her greatest source of worry. When I was in law school, I'd spend summers working in my grandmother's office, filing documents and learning the intricacies of estate law. She'd often talk to me about her clients, never breaking confidentiality, but sharing the legal challenges and ethical dilemmas that came with managing family wealth across generations. The hardest part, she told me one afternoon as we organized trust documents, isn't writing the legal language, it's trying to protect families from themselves. She was specifically thinking about the Stones when she said that. Old Henry Stone, Mason's grandfather, had been a remarkable man. He'd started with nothing. The son of a factory worker who'd built Stone Industries through pure determination, brilliant business instincts, and an absolute refusal to accept failure. By the time he died, the company employed over 3,000 people and generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue. But Henry Stone had also been a realist. He'd watched too many wealthy families destroy themselves through entitlement, laziness, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never facing consequences. He'd seen children and grandchildren who'd never worked a day in their lives squander fortunes that had taken generations to build. So when he'd hired my grandmother to structure the family trust, he'd made very specific requests. "I want provisions," he'd told her during one of their planning meetings. "I want safeguards. If my children or their children turn out to be the kind of people who think wealth makes them better than others, I want them to lose access to that wealth until they learn better." My grandmother had spent months crafting those provisions. The trust wasn't just about transferring money. It was about ensuring that Stone family wealth would only support people who demonstrated the values Henry had built the company on: hard work, respect for others, ethical business practices, and genuine competence. The behavioral clauses were detailed and specific. Any beneficiary who demonstrated persistent patterns of unprofessional conduct, disrespectful treatment of employees or business associates, unethical business practices, or conduct that brings dishonor to the Stone family legacy, could have their trust access suspended pending a formal review. But here's what made those clauses truly powerful. Henry Stone had insisted that the monitoring and enforcement authority couldn't be held by family members or company employees. It had to be independent, objective, and completely immune to family pressure or corporate politics. That's why he'd given that authority to my grandmother, and through the legal succession clauses to whoever inherited her practice and responsibilities. For 25 years, those clauses had remained dormant. Mason's father, Archie Stone, had been everything his own father had hoped for: hardworking, respectful, genuinely committed to running the company ethically. The behavioral provisions had never needed to be activated. But Mason was different. Even as a teenager, he'd shown troubling signs. My grandmother had mentioned incidents over the years: how he'd berate restaurant servers, how he'd gotten kicked out of 2 different prep schools for bullying, how he'd crashed 3 different cars and always blamed someone else. When he'd joined the company after college, the pattern had only gotten worse. My grandmother had started keeping a file on Mason's behavior almost by accident. Employees would sometimes contact her office, not to make formal complaints, but because they knew she had some connection to the Stone family and they didn't know where else to turn. A secretary who'd been humiliated in a meeting, a junior analyst whose ideas had been stolen, a cleaning staff member who'd been fired after Mason decided her accent was unprofessional. None of these people understood the legal implications of what they were reporting. They were just decent people who'd been hurt and were looking for someone who might listen. But my grandmother understood exactly what those reports represented: documentation of the kind of behavior Henry Stone had specifically written the trust clauses to prevent. When my grandmother passed away, I'd inherited more than just her legal files. I'd inherited a moral responsibility that had been building for years. The decision to take the assistant position at Stone Industries hadn't been about revenge. It had been about documentation. I needed to observe Mason's behavior firsthand, to build an ironclad case that would satisfy the legal requirements for invoking the competency review process. I needed witnesses, specific incidents, and evidence that his conduct was systematic rather than occasional. Stone Industries' corporate culture made my job easier than I'd expected. The company had grown into one of those environments where wealth and power had created a bubble of enablement around the Stone family. Board members who owed their positions to family connections, executives who'd learned that questioning Mason's decisions was career suicide, and a general atmosphere where speaking up about inappropriate behavior was seen as disloyalty rather than integrity. In my 3 years as an executive assistant, I'd documented everything. The time Mason had fired a pregnant employee for requesting reasonable accommodation, the contract negotiations where he'd deliberately misled business partners about delivery timelines, the company party where he'd cornered a young intern and made comments that would have resulted in criminal charges if she'd been willing to press them. But I'd also documented something else: the systematic way that everyone around Mason had learned to look the other way. Board members who heard his cruel comments and said nothing. Senior executives who witnessed his unethical practices and chose to protect their own positions instead of speaking up. An entire corporate structure that had evolved to shield one person's bad behavior from consequences. The competency review process that my grandmother had designed wasn't just about Mason's personal conduct. It was about examining the entire system that had enabled and protected that conduct for years. Every person who'd laughed along with his cruel jokes, every executive who'd covered up his mistakes, every board member who'd chosen loyalty over integrity. The review process would examine all of it, and the trust clauses gave me the authority to recommend corporate restructuring, leadership changes, and even complete board replacement if necessary. But I'd needed the perfect catalyst, one moment so clear, so well witnessed, so undeniably representative of Mason's character, that it would justify everything that was about to happen. That moment had come this morning, when Mason decided to humiliate me in front of 8 board members for the simple act of delivering legal documents. What he didn't know was that among those documents were the formal papers beginning the competency review process, papers that I'd been preparing for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to serve them. And thanks to his own arrogance, his own need to demonstrate his power over someone he saw as beneath him, Mason Stone had just provided me with the perfect foundation for everything that was about to unfold. The war he'd declared was about to begin, but he was the only one who didn't know he was already fighting it. For 3 years, I'd been the perfect executive assistant, arriving early, staying late, anticipating needs before they were voiced, and moving through the halls of Stone Industries like a shadow that people noticed just enough to appreciate, but never enough to truly see. But while everyone assumed I was simply excelling at administrative work, I was actually conducting the most thorough legal investigation of my career. The beautiful thing about being an executive assistant to the chief legal officer is that you have access to everything. Every contract, every meeting, every confidential conversation that happens in the legal department eventually crosses your desk or happens within earshot of your carefully positioned workstation. And in a company where the CEO's son regularly involved himself in legal matters he didn't understand, that meant I had front-row seats to 3 years of documented incompetence and ethical violations. My preparation strategy was methodical, systematic, and completely invisible to everyone around me. I'd learned from my grandmother that the best legal cases are built on irrefutable documentation, credible witnesses, and patterns of behavior that are so consistent they become impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents. So I became a collector of moments. Every morning I'd arrive at Stone Industries at 7:15 a.m., a full 45 minutes before my official start time. I'd use those quiet minutes to organize my files, review my notes from the previous day, and prepare for whatever fresh documentation opportunities Mason's behavior might provide. I kept 3 sets of records: my official administrative files that anyone could access, my personal notes that I kept at home, and a secure digital archive that I stored on an encrypted server my law school classmate had helped me set up. The digital archive was my masterpiece. Every incident was documented with dates, times, witnesses present, and exact quotes whenever possible. I developed a system of discrete audio recording using a pen device that my cousin in law enforcement had recommended, completely legal in our state, as long as I was present for the conversations, and invaluable for capturing Mason's exact words when he thought no one important was listening. Within the first 6 months, I'd established patterns that would have made my grandmother proud of my thoroughness. Pattern 1. Systematic humiliation of support staff. Mason had a particular talent for identifying the employees who were least likely to fight back: people with families to support, immigrants worried about their visa status, older workers who couldn't easily find new jobs. He'd target them with public criticism, impossible deadlines, and the kind of casual cruelty that made them feel grateful just to keep their positions. I documented 17 specific incidents in year 1 alone: the time he made Maria, the night cleaning supervisor, re-clean his entire office because he'd smelled something ethnic when he'd arrived that morning, the incident where he'd accused David, a junior accountant, of stealing company supplies loudly in front of the entire accounting department because David had taken a pack of pens home to help his daughter with homework, the meeting where he'd introduced Jennifer, a brilliant financial analyst, as the one who does numbers when she was presenting her own research to potential investors. Each incident was carefully documented: date, time, witnesses, exact quotes, and follow-up consequences. More importantly, I'd tracked down the affected employees afterward, often months later, to document the long-term impact of these incidents on their careers and well-being. Pattern 2. Unethical business practices that the legal department was forced to cover up. This was where my position gave me unique access to information that would have been impossible to obtain from anywhere else in the company. I learned about the Hartwell Industries contract negotiations, where Mason had deliberately provided false financial projections to inflate Stone Industries' position, forcing the legal team to find creative ways to make the numbers work retroactively. I discovered the incident with Meridian Financial, where Mason had promised deliverables he knew the company couldn't meet, then blamed the engineering department when the client threatened to sue for breach of contract. Most damaging of all, I documented the systematic way Mason used his family connections to win contracts that should have gone to more qualified competitors. He'd call board members from companies his father had relationships with, making it clear that choosing Stone Industries wasn't just a business decision, it was a personal favor to the Stone family. I'd recorded phone calls where he'd laughed about playing the family card, and meetings where he'd openly discussed using his trust fund to finance personal investments through company accounts. Technically legal but ethically questionable transactions that put Stone Industries at risk. Pattern 3. The enablement system that protected all of this behavior. This was perhaps the most important part of my documentation because it demonstrated that Mason's conduct wasn't happening in isolation, it was being systematically protected by people who should have been holding him accountable. I documented board meetings where directors heard Mason's inappropriate comments and chose to laugh along rather than address them. I recorded conversations where senior executives discussed Mason's mistakes in private but publicly supported his decisions. I tracked email chains where the legal department was pressured to find ways to justify questionable practices rather than advise against them. The most revealing documents were the internal performance reviews where Mason consistently received ratings that bore no resemblance to his actual performance. I discovered that his direct supervisor had been instructed by the board to ensure Mason's reviews reflected leadership potential rather than actual competence, a directive that came directly from board chair Thomas Wright during a conversation I'd overheard while organizing conference room materials. But beyond the systematic documentation, I'd also been building the legal framework for what was coming. During lunch breaks and evenings, I'd been consulting with former law school classmates who specialized in trust law, corporate governance, and employment regulations. I'd researched precedent cases, identified expert witnesses, and prepared the legal briefs that would be necessary to support the competency review process. I'd also been building relationships throughout Stone Industries, not the kind of obvious networking that would have drawn attention, but the quiet connections that form when you consistently treat people with respect and kindness. The security guards who knew I always asked about their families, the maintenance staff who appreciated that I learned their names and said good morning, the junior employees who discovered that I was someone they could trust with their concerns. These relationships weren't strategic in the calculating sense. I genuinely cared about these people and was genuinely troubled by how Mason treated them, but they also created a network of witnesses and allies who could provide testimony when the time came. Most importantly, I'd been preparing for the inevitable challenge to my authority. I knew that when I activated the competency review process, Stone Industries' corporate lawyers would immediately try to challenge my legal standing, question my documentation, and argue that the trust clauses were outdated or unenforceable. So I'd retained my own legal counsel, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in corporate fraud cases and who'd been fascinated by the unique legal mechanisms my grandmother had created in the Stone family trust. I'd also arranged for independent document authentication, expert testimony on trust law precedents, and forensic accounting support for when we needed to examine the financial impact of Mason's business decisions. The morning Mason called me just a secretary in front of the board, I wasn't just a humiliated employee planning revenge. I was a licensed attorney with 3 years of meticulous documentation, a comprehensive legal strategy, and all the evidence necessary to demonstrate that the competency review process wasn't just justified, it was urgently necessary to protect the Stone family legacy from someone who was systematically destroying it. But Mason had no idea that his casual cruelty was about to activate a legal mechanism that had been waiting 43 years for exactly this moment. The decision to finally act came 4 hours after the board meeting, in the most unexpected place possible, the employee break room on the 3rd floor, where I'd gone to grab a cup of coffee and process what had just happened in that conference room. I'd spent 3 years building my case methodically, documenting incidents, establishing patterns, and waiting for the perfect moment to activate the competency review process. But sitting there in that sterile break room, listening to a conversation I was never meant to hear, I realized that waiting any longer would make me complicit in something unforgivable. The break room was nearly empty at 2:30 in the afternoon, just me at a corner table supposedly reviewing emails on my phone while actually transcribing my notes from the morning's humiliation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the perpetual smell of burned coffee filled the air. It was the kind of mundane corporate space where real conversations rarely happened, which is probably why Mason felt safe having the phone call that changed everything. He'd walked in talking loudly into his Bluetooth headset, that same arrogant energy from the board meeting still radiating from him as he grabbed a bottle of water from the vending machine. I looked up briefly, then back down at my phone, maintaining the invisibility that had served me so well for 3 years. In his mind, I was just part of the furniture, safe to ignore, harmless to dismiss. No, you don't understand, Mason was saying into his headset, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when he thought he was being clever. The Westbrook project is perfect for this. We can restructure the entire timeline, blame it on supply chain issues, and push the completion date back by 6 months. I kept typing on my phone, but every word was burning itself into my memory. The Westbrook project was Stone Industries' biggest contract of the year, a $50 million construction management deal for a new hospital complex in downtown Millbrook Heights. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, and meeting the deadline was crucial because the hospital needed to open before the old facility's lease expired. Listen, Jack, Mason continued, using the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow student, here's what you're not seeing. If we delay Westbrook, we free up resources for the Morrison Industrial Project. That one's smaller, but it's my project, you understand. My name on it, my reputation, my success story for the board. My fingers had stopped moving on my phone. I was no longer pretending to work. I was listening with the full attention of someone who understood exactly what they were hearing. Mason laughed, the same cruel sound I'd heard in the board meeting. The hospital? They'll figure it out. Maybe they'll have to extend their current lease. Maybe they'll have to delay opening. Not my problem. The Morrison deal needs to go perfectly, and that means Westbrook gets delayed. I felt something shift inside my chest, not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity that cut through 3 years of careful patience. This wasn't just another example of Mason's selfishness or incompetence. This was active sabotage of a project that would affect thousands of people's access to healthcare, all so he could ensure his own project received adequate resources and attention. How do we make it look legitimate? Mason was asking, pacing now between the vending machines and the microwave. Easy. We've been documenting unexpected complications for weeks, supply chain disruptions, Regulatory delays, technical challenges, all perfectly plausible, all impossible to disprove. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the call. No, the project manager won't be a problem. Bronte's good at her job, but she's not going to question decisions that come from the executive level. And if she does, Mason's voice took on that familiar edge of casual threat. Well, she's got 2 kids and a mortgage. She'll adapt. Bronte Croft. I knew her, a brilliant engineer who'd been with Stone Industries for 8 years, someone who'd earned her project management position through genuine competence and dedication. She was also someone who'd trusted the company to support the projects she managed, never imagining that executive decisions were being made based on personal advancement rather than professional responsibility. But it was Mason's next comment that transformed my careful documentation into urgent action. The best part, he said, his voice full of that self-satisfied smugness I'd heard 1,000 times, is that when Westbrook eventually fails, and it will, because 6 months delay in a project like that creates cascade problems we can't fix, we can blame it on the project team, incompetent management, poor planning, failure to anticipate challenges. I'll write the post-mortem report myself. The casualness of it was what broke something inside me. Not just the plan to sabotage a hospital project, not just the willingness to destroy Bronte's career, but the complete absence of any consideration for the real-world consequences of his actions. Thousands of people who needed medical care, hundreds of construction workers whose jobs depended on meeting deadlines, an entire community that was counting on the new hospital facility, none of them existed in Mason's calculation beyond obstacles to his personal success. Trust me, Mason was saying as he headed toward the break room exit, by the time anyone realizes what happened, Morrison Industrial will be such a success story that no one will remember Westbrook was ever supposed to finish on time, and I'll be the executive who delivered a flawless project under budget and ahead of schedule. The break room door swung shut behind him, leaving me alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the burned coffee smell and the absolute certainty that my time for patient documentation had just ended. For 3 years, I'd been building a case based on patterns of behavior, systematic mistreatment, and ethical violations that harmed individual employees. But what I'd just heard was something else entirely, a deliberate plan to sabotage a major project for personal gain, with complete disregard for the community impact and the careers of innocent people who would be blamed for his machinations. This wasn't behavior that needed to be documented for future action. This was a crisis that demanded immediate intervention. I sat in that break room for another 10 minutes, not because I was uncertain about what to do, but because I needed to fully process the magnitude of what was about to happen. Once I activated the competency review process, there would be no going back. Mason's trust fund access would be frozen, his authority within the company would be suspended, and every business decision he'd made over the past year would be subject to independent review. But more than that, I was about to use legal authority that had been dormant for over 4 decades to potentially restructure one of the most powerful companies in Millbrook Heights. The trust clauses my grandmother had written gave me extraordinary power, but they also carried extraordinary responsibility. When I finally stood up from that corner table and walked back to my desk, I wasn't just Evie Hall, executive assistant returning to her afternoon duties. I was Evie Hall, attorney and legal successor, about to invoke powers that Mason Stone never knew existed to prevent damage that he couldn't even imagine. The papers I'd been carrying in that leather portfolio that morning weren't just preliminary documents anymore. They were about to become the foundation for the most comprehensive corporate intervention of my legal career. Mason Stone had just talked himself into exactly the kind of situation his grandfather had written the trust clauses to prevent. And unlike his previous victims, I had the power to make sure he faced consequences that matched the magnitude of what he was planning to do. The first shot in the war, Mason didn't know he was fighting, came at exactly 4:47 p.m. that same day, delivered through the most mundane method possible, a registered mail delivery to the Stone Industries legal department. I'd spent the 2 hours after Mason's break room phone call activating legal mechanisms that had been dormant since my grandmother's retirement. 3 phone calls to the trust administration firm in Hartford, 2 encrypted emails to my retained counsel, 1 formal notification to the Millbrook County court system, and a series of documents that transformed from preliminary paperwork into active legal proceedings with nothing more than my signature and seal as legal successor to the Stone family trust. The beautiful thing about the competency review process my grandmother had designed was its surgical precision. It didn't require dramatic confrontations or public announcements. It simply activated like a security system that had been quietly armed for decades, waiting for someone to trip the carefully constructed triggers. The registered mail envelope was addressed to Charlotte Finch, Stone Industries' chief legal officer and my direct supervisor. Inside were 3 documents that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics within the company, though Charlotte had no way of understanding their significance when she signed for the delivery. The first document was a formal notification of trust review proceedings, written in the precise legal language that my grandmother had perfected over decades of estate work. It informed Stone Industries that the behavioral compliance clauses of the Stone Family Trust had been activated, and that all trust-related financial transfers, including salary supplements, expense accounts, and discretionary funds, would be suspended pending completion of the review process. The second document was more specific, a detailed inventory of Mason's current trust fund access, including the monthly $50,000 supplement that topped up his official salary, the unlimited expense account that covered his car payments, travel, and entertainment costs, and the discretionary fund that he used for everything from his downtown condo rent to his weekend gambling trips to Atlantic City. The third document was the one that would cause immediate visible consequences, a freeze order on all corporate credit cards, expense accounts, and financial authorizations tied to Mason's position as heir to the Stone Family Trust. I knew exactly when Charlotte opened that envelope, because I heard her sharp intake of breath from my desk outside her office, followed by the sound of her chair rolling back from her desk with unusual force. "Evie," she called through her open door, her voice carrying a tension I'd never heard before. "Could you come in here, please?" Charlotte Finch was a brilliant attorney who'd earned her position through 15 years of meticulous legal work and strategic thinking. She was also someone who understood immediately when routine corporate operations had just become complicated by family trust law, an area that most corporate lawyers avoided because it combined legal complexity with family politics in ways that rarely ended well for anyone involved. I walked into her office carrying my notepad, maintaining the same professional demeanor I'd cultivated for 3 years. Charlotte was standing behind her desk, the 3 documents spread out in front of her like evidence in a case she hadn't expected to be handling. "Evie," she said carefully, "I need you to help me understand something. This notification references a legal successor to the Margaret Hall practice, with authority over Stone Family Trust compliance. Do you know anything about this?" It was the moment I'd been preparing for since I'd first applied for the position 3 years ago. The moment when my carefully maintained invisibility would transform into the kind of legal authority that corporate lawyers respect above almost everything else. "Yes," I said quietly, setting down my notepad and meeting her eyes directly. "I'm the legal successor referenced in those documents." The silence that followed was profound. Charlotte was clearly processing multiple levels of information simultaneously. The legal implications of the documents, the realization that her executive assistant was actually a licensed attorney, and the growing understanding that whatever was happening was far more serious than routine family trust administration. "You're Margaret Hall's successor," she said slowly, not quite a question. "Her granddaughter and legal heir to the practice," I confirmed. "Licensed attorney, specialized in estate planning and trust administration. I've been monitoring compliance with the behavioral clauses of the Stone Family Trust for the past 3 years." Charlotte sat down heavily in her chair, the full magnitude of the situation beginning to register. As chief legal officer, she understood exactly what trust behavioral clauses could do to a beneficiary who'd violated their terms. She also understood that if those clauses were being activated, someone had documented serious misconduct with enough evidence to satisfy legal standards. "The behavioral clauses," she said, reaching for the first document again. "These have been dormant for 43 years, I finished. Henry Stone wrote them specifically to prevent the kind of conduct that his grandson has been exhibiting. My grandmother documented the original incidents in the 1980s and early 1990s, but they were never severe enough to warrant activation. The current situation is different." Charlotte was reading through the notification more carefully now, her legal mind processing the specific language and understanding its implications. "This freezes all trust-related financial access immediately," she said. "Effective as of the timestamp on the court filing," I confirmed. 4:23 p.m. today. Which means that as of 24 minutes ago, Mason Stone's corporate credit cards are deactivated, his expense accounts are frozen, and his supplemental income from the trust has been suspended pending the outcome of the review process. The timing hadn't been accidental. I'd calculated exactly when to file the documents to ensure that Mason would discover the financial freeze in the most public way possible when he tried to use his corporate card for dinner with clients at the exclusive Harbor Club, where he dined every Tuesday evening to discuss business development with potential investors. Charlotte's phone rang at exactly 5:15 p.m., just as I'd predicted. "Charlotte, what the hell is going on?" Mason's voice was loud enough that I could hear it clearly from my position in the chair across from Charlotte's desk. "My card was declined at Harbor Club, in front of the Meridian financial team. Do you have any idea how embarrassing?" "Mason," Charlotte interrupted, her voice taking on the careful tone that lawyers use when they're about to deliver bad news. "I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a legal situation that requires your immediate attention." "A legal situation? What kind of legal situation could possibly?" "The kind that involves trust fund compliance and behavioral review clauses that were written into the original Stone family trust documents. The kind that has just frozen your access to all trust-related financial resources pending a formal review process." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Charlotte glanced at her phone to make sure the call hadn't been dropped. "I'll be right there," Mason finally said, his voice having lost all of its usual arrogance and taken on something that sounded remarkably like fear. After Charlotte hung up, she looked at me with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that her quiet, efficient executive assistant had just orchestrated the most sophisticated legal maneuver she'd witnessed in her 15-year career. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. 3 years of active preparation," I said. "But the legal framework has been in place since Today's incident involved Mason planning to deliberately sabotage the Westbrook Hospital project to ensure resources for his personal Morrison industrial project, with complete disregard for community impact and intention to blame innocent project managers for artificially created failures." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, the full scope of the legal and ethical implications becoming clear. "You have documentation of this? Audio recording, witness statements, and a comprehensive file of similar incidents spanning 3 years, all prepared according to legal standards for trust compliance review." When Mason arrived 8 minutes later, still wearing his expensive suit but no longer carrying the casual confidence that had defined him that morning, he walked into a legal reality that had been specifically designed by his own grandfather to address exactly the kind of person he'd become. He just didn't know it yet. Mason burst through Charlotte's office door at 5:23 p.m., looking like a man who'd just discovered that his entire world operated according to rules he'd never bothered to learn. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, his expensive tie was loosened, and his face carried the kind of frantic energy that comes from having your credit card declined in front of people whose respect you desperately need. "What is this?" he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries as he waved his phone in the air. "I just got off the phone with American Express. They're telling me my corporate account has been frozen by court order." "Court order, Charlotte? What possible legal authority could—" He stopped mid-sentence when he noticed me sitting in the chair across from Charlotte's desk, my notepad balanced on my lap, watching him with the same professional composure I'd maintained for 3 years. But something in my expression must have been different, because his voice faltered as he continued. "Why is she here?" he asked Charlotte, gesturing toward me with the dismissive wave I'd seen him use with countless other employees. "This is a private legal matter." "Actually," Charlotte said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was still processing the full implications of what she'd learned. "Evie is here because this legal matter directly involves her professional authority as legal successor to the Margaret Hall practice." Mason stared at Charlotte like she'd started speaking in a foreign language. "Margaret Hall? What does my grandfather's old lawyer have to do with anything? She's been retired for years. She passed away 5 years ago," I said quietly, speaking directly to Mason for the first time since the morning's humiliation. I inherited her practice and her responsibilities as successor counsel to the Stone Family Trust. The confusion on Mason's face was almost comical. He looked between Charlotte and me several times, clearly trying to process information that didn't fit into his understanding of how the world worked. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that my family's secretary somehow has legal authority over my trust fund." "I'm not your family's secretary," I replied, my voice remaining calm and professional. "I'm a licensed attorney who has been monitoring your compliance with the behavioral clauses of your trust for the past 3 years, and as of this afternoon, I've determined that your conduct has violated those clauses sufficiently to warrant suspension of all trust-related financial access." Mason laughed, The same cruel sound I'd heard in the boardroom that morning, but tinged now with something that sounded like desperation. This is insane. You can't just freeze someone's money because you don't like their attitude. Charlotte, tell her this isn't how trust law works. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. Actually, Mason, this is exactly how trust law works when the original trust documents include behavioral compliance clauses with specific enforcement mechanisms. Your grandfather was very thorough in his legal planning. Behavioral compliance clauses. Mason's voice was rising now, taking on the edge of panic that comes from realizing you're in a fight you don't understand. What behavioral compliance clauses? I opened my portfolio and removed a thick document. Not the modern legal filings from that afternoon, but a photocopy of the original trust agreement from 1981, marked with yellow highlighting and annotated with my grandmother's precise handwriting. Section 12, subsection 4, I said, reading directly from the document. Any beneficiary who demonstrates persistent patterns of unprofessional conduct, disrespectful treatment of employees or business associates, unethical business practices, or conduct that brings dishonor to the Stone family legacy may have their trust access suspended pending a formal competency review. Mason grabbed the document from my hands, his eyes scanning the legal language with the frantic energy of someone looking for an escape clause. This is 40 years old. These clauses are outdated, unenforceable. On the contrary, Charlotte interrupted, her legal training taking over. Trust behavioral clauses are specifically designed to remain enforceable across generations, and according to these documents, the monitoring and enforcement authority was deliberately placed outside family control to prevent exactly the kind of challenge you're attempting right now. Mason's phone rang, cutting through the tension in the room. He glanced at the caller ID and his face went pale. "It's my father," he said, staring at the phone like it might explode. "Answer it," Charlotte advised. "He's probably received the same court notifications that were sent to the corporate legal department." Mason swiped to accept the call, his hand visibly shaking. "Dad, I can explain," but whatever Archie Stone was saying on the other end of the line was clearly not a request for explanation. Mason's face cycled through several shades of red as he listened, occasionally trying to interject with "but" or "it's not," before being cut off again. Finally, after what felt like the longest 2 minutes in corporate history, Mason said, "Yes, sir. I understand. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and looked at Charlotte with the expression of someone who'd just learned that their problems were much bigger than they'd initially understood. "My father wants to see me immediately," he said. "He's calling an emergency board meeting for 7 o'clock tonight. Apparently the trust freeze affects more than just my personal accounts." This was the moment I'd been waiting for, when Mason would begin to understand that the competency review process wasn't just about his individual behavior, but about the broader implications of how that behavior had affected company operations. "The trust documents are very specific about corporate involvement," I explained, pulling out another set of papers. "When a beneficiary's access is suspended, any company resources that have been used to supplement or support trust-related activities must also be reviewed and potentially frozen." Mason stared at me like I'd just told him the building was on fire. "What does that mean exactly?" Charlotte was reading over the documents I'd provided, her legal mind quickly grasping the implications. "It means," she said slowly, "that any corporate resources that have been used in ways that benefit you personally, rather than the company directly, could be subject to clawback provisions." "The corner office," I said, consulting my notes, "is designated in corporate records as executive space allocated based on family trust status rather than job performance. The company car, the executive assistant budget, the discretionary travel fund, all of these are tied to your position as trust beneficiary rather than your role as an employee." Mason dropped into the chair next to mine, the full scope of his situation finally beginning to register. "You're telling me I could lose my office?" "Among other things," I confirmed. "The review process also examines whether trust beneficiaries have been using company resources inappropriately, making business decisions that benefit personal interests over corporate interests, or creating liability risks for the company through unethical conduct." Mason's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and his face went ashen. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. "Security just informed me that my keycard access to the executive floor has been deactivated," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Effective immediately." I checked my watch. 5:45 p.m. That would be the automatic security protocol, I explained. When trust access is frozen, all company resources tied to that access are suspended pending review. It's designed to prevent further potential misuse while the investigation is conducted. Mason stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, his movements agitated and unfocused. "How long does this review process take?" "That depends," I said, "on the scope of the investigation required and the level of cooperation from all parties involved. Simple cases with clear documentation can be resolved in a matter of weeks. Complex cases involving multiple violations, potential corporate liability, and uncooperative subjects can take months." "Months." Mason spun around to face me, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't go months without access to my accounts. I have expenses, obligations, which is exactly what your grandfather anticipated when he wrote these clauses," I replied. "The financial pressure is meant to encourage prompt resolution through acknowledgement of wrongdoing and commitment to behavioral change." Charlotte's office phone rang and she glanced at the caller ID with a grimace. "It's the board chairman," she said. "I need to take this." While Charlotte answered the call, Mason slumped back into his chair, the fight going out of him as the reality of his situation set in. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like someone who understood that his actions had consequences he couldn't simply buy or charm his way out of. But as I watched him sitting there, processing the collapse of his privileged bubble, I knew that the escalation was just beginning. The competency review process didn't just affect Mason. It would examine every business decision he'd influenced, every employee he'd mistreated, and every way that Stone Industries had been shaped by his presence, including his plan to sabotage the Westbrook Hospital project, which was scheduled to begin implementation the very next morning. The Stone Industries executive boardroom had never felt smaller than it did at 7:04 p.m. that evening, when Mason walked through the heavy oak doors to find 8 board members, his father and me, seated around the same mahogany table where he'd humiliated me 12 hours earlier. The afternoon had transformed everything. The same room that had echoed with cruel laughter that morning now hummed with the kind of tense silence that precedes corporate executions. The late evening light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the polished table, and the usual warmth of the wood-paneled walls felt cold and imposing. Mason's father, Archie Stone, sat at the head of the table with the bearing of a man who'd built an empire through careful decisions and ethical leadership, only to discover that his son had been systematically undermining everything he'd worked to create. At 64, Archie carried himself with the quiet authority that comes from earning respect rather than inheriting it, and the disappointment in his eyes was more devastating than any amount of anger could have been. "Sit down, Mason," Archie said quietly, gesturing to the only empty chair at the table, the same seat Mason had occupied that morning when he'd felt untouchable and entitled. Now it felt like a defendant's chair in a courtroom. I sat to Archie's right, the leather portfolio open in front of me, no longer playing the role of invisible assistant, but occupying the position that my grandmother had held for over 2 decades, legal counsel to the Stone family, with all the authority and responsibility that role entailed. Board members Patricia Blackwood, Thomas Wright, James Lewis, and 4 others who'd witnessed the morning's humiliation, sat with folders of documents that I'd provided during the emergency preparation session. Their faces carried the expressions of people who'd just learned that their company had been exposed to massive legal and financial liability through the actions of someone they'd been enabling for years. "Before we begin," Archie said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for the most serious corporate matters, "I want everyone in this room to understand the gravity of what we're discussing. This isn't a family dispute or a personnel issue. This is a formal competency review proceeding under the Stone Family Trust, with potential implications for corporate governance, legal liability, and the future leadership of this company." Mason shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing around the table at faces that no longer looked at him with indulgence or family loyalty. "Dad, I think we're overreacting to what's essentially a misunderstanding about trust administration." "A misunderstanding?" Patricia Blackwood interrupted, opening the folder in front of her. "Mason, we've spent the past 2 hours reviewing documentation that Ms. Hall has provided regarding your conduct over the past 3 years. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of behavior that has created massive liability for this company." Thomas Wright, the board's longest-serving member, leaned forward with the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. "We've reviewed the legal exposure from the Meridian financial contract manipulations, the Hartwell Industries misrepresentations, and at least 6 employment law violations that could result in significant litigation. But none of that compares," James Lewis added, his voice tight with controlled anger, to what we learned about the Westbrook project. The mention of Westbrook caused Mason's face to drain of color. He glanced toward me with something that looked like panic, clearly wondering how much I knew and how much I'd shared. "Miss Hall," Archie said, turning toward me with formal politeness that acknowledged my professional authority, "would you please explain to the board what you discovered regarding the Westbrook Hospital project?" I opened my portfolio and removed the digital transcript of Mason's phone call, along with the audio file on a small recording device. At approximately 2:35 p.m. today, I overheard and recorded a phone conversation in which Mason Stone outlined a plan to deliberately sabotage the Westbrook Hospital construction project by diverting resources to ensure the success of the Morrison Industrial Project. The silence that followed was profound. Board members exchanged glances that spoke of shared horror at the legal and ethical implications of what they'd just heard. "Play the recording," Archie said quietly. For the next 3 minutes, Mason's voice filled the boardroom, detailing his plan to delay a $50 million hospital project that would serve thousands of patients, explaining how he would blame innocent project managers like Bronte Croft for problems he intended to create, and laughing about writing the post-mortem report that would destroy careers to cover his own tracks. When the recording ended, the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Mason sat slumped in his chair, looking like someone who'd just watched his own execution. "The hospital project," Patricia Blackwood said slowly, "serves the entire eastern district of Millbrook Heights. The delays you're planning would affect thousands of people's access to health care. And the resources you're planning to divert," Thomas Wright added, "represent contractual obligations that could expose this company to breach of contract litigation that could cost us everything." Archie Stone looked at his son with an expression that combined disappointment, anger, and something that looked like grief. "Explain yourself," he said simply. Mason tried to summon his usual confidence, but his voice cracked as he spoke. "It's just business strategy, Dad. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to ensure optimal outcomes. Optimal for whom?" I interrupted, speaking for the first time since the recording had played. "Optimal for the patients who won't have access to the new hospital facility. Optimal for Bronte Croft, whose career you're planning to destroy. Optimal for the construction workers whose jobs depend on meeting project deadlines." "You don't understand," Mason said, turning toward me with desperation in his voice. "The Morrison project is crucial for my development as an executive. It needs to succeed. At the cost of deliberately sabotaging a hospital project." James Lewis's voice carried outrage that had been building for hours. "Mason, do you have any idea what you're saying?" Archie stood up from his chair, his movement slow and deliberate. At 6 feet 2 inches, he commanded the room through presence rather than volume, and when he spoke, every word carried the weight of 40 years of ethical business leadership. "This ends now," he said quietly. "Not just the Westbrook sabotage, which will absolutely not happen. Not just the trust fund access, which has already been suspended. This," he gestured around the table, "your position in this company, your authority over projects and people, your ability to make decisions that affect other people's lives, all of it ends now." Mason stood up as well, panic now clearly visible in his movements. "Dad, you can't just—" "I'm not doing anything," Archie replied. "The trust clauses that my father wrote 43 years ago are doing exactly what they were designed to do. Miss Hall, what are the next steps in the competency review process?" I consulted my documents, feeling the weight of 43 years of careful legal planning behind every word I spoke. The formal review includes several phases. First, immediate suspension of all trust-related benefits and corporate authorities pending investigation. Second, comprehensive review of all business decisions made by the subject over the past 18 months. Third, independent assessment of corporate culture and governance issues that enabled the problematic behavior. And fourth, Patricia Blackwood asked, recommendations for corporate restructuring to prevent future violations, including potential changes to board composition, executive oversight procedures, and accountability measures for family members in leadership positions. Thomas Wright leaned back in his chair, the full scope of the review process becoming clear. "You're talking about potentially restructuring the entire company. The trust clauses give me that authority when patterns of misconduct threaten the company's ethical foundations," I confirmed. Henry Stone was very specific about protecting the company from family members who might damage its reputation or operate. Marcus, a warehouse supervisor in Detroit, contacted me about a manager who'd been creating hostile work environments for immigrant employees. Knowing they were afraid to report problems, Marcus had used my documentation strategies to build a case that resulted in the manager's termination and comprehensive diversity training for the entire facility. Dr. Jennifer Park, a hospital administrator in Seattle, had been dealing with a department head who sexually harassed female staff and used his medical credentials to intimidate anyone who questioned his behavior. She'd used the systematic approach I'd outlined to build an ironclad case that led to his termination and the creation of new reporting procedures that protected healthcare workers. These weren't people with special legal training or family trust funds that gave them unique leverage. They were ordinary employees who'd learned that documentation, patience, and strategic thinking could be more powerful than titles or connections when used by someone committed to protecting others. But the most important messages came from people who recognized themselves in the victims of Mason's behavior rather than in my position as the person who stopped him. Maria Santos, the cleaning supervisor whom Mason had humiliated, now speaks regularly at leadership conferences about dignity in the workplace. Her presentation, titled "Everyone Matters: Creating Respect Across All Levels," has been viewed over 500,000 times online and has inspired policy changes at dozens of companies. David Chen, the junior accountant Mason had falsely accused of theft, completed his MBA while working full-time and now runs Stone Industries' ethics training program. His insights into how false accusations affect employee trust and company culture have become foundational to our training materials. Jennifer Walsh, the financial analyst Mason had dismissed as the one who does numbers, was recently featured on the cover of Finance Professional magazine for her innovative approaches to strategic planning. In her interview, she talked about how surviving workplace humiliation had taught her to value substance over style and competence over charisma. These transformations remind me daily that the real victory wasn't Mason's downfall, it was the restoration of dignity and opportunity for people who deserved better than they'd been receiving. The experience has also taught me profound lessons about the nature of justice and accountability that I want to share with anyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of abuse. First, documentation is everything. Every cruel comment, every ethical violation, every example of abuse needs to be recorded with dates, times, witnesses, and specific details. People who abuse power count on their victims not having credible evidence. Systematic documentation changes that dynamic completely. Second, patterns matter more than individual incidents. One cruel comment can be dismissed as a bad day. 17 documented incidents over 3 years represent a character issue that can't be explained away. Build your case systematically, and let the pattern speak for itself. Third, allies are everywhere, even when you can't see them. For every person who laughs along with a bully's cruel jokes, there are usually several others who are uncomfortable but don't know how to intervene. When you speak up with documentation and courage, you give those silent allies permission to support you. Fourth, institutional power often trumps personal authority. Mason had family connections and inherited wealth, but my legal authority under the trust clauses was institutional and couldn't be overridden by personal relationships. Look for the systems, policies, and procedures that can support your case rather than relying on individual personalities. Fifth, timing is crucial. Act too early, and you don't have enough evidence. Wait too long, and more people get hurt. The moment Mason planned to sabotage the hospital project was the perfect catalyst because it represented immediate harm to innocent people rather than just ongoing workplace unpleasantness. But beyond these tactical lessons, this experience has taught me something deeper about how change really happens in organizations and communities. Real transformation doesn't come from dramatic confrontations or public shaming. It comes from patient people who care enough about others to do the difficult work of documentation, preparation, and strategic intervention. It comes from individuals who understand that having power means using it to protect people who have less power, not to advance personal interests. The trust fund mechanism my grandmother created was unique, but the principles it represented are universal. Every organization needs accountability measures for people in positions of authority. Every workplace needs protection for employees who witness misconduct. Every community needs individuals who are willing to speak truth to power when the situation demands it. The Stone Industries transformation happened because one person, my grandmother, had the foresight to create systemic safeguards against abuse of power. But it only worked because another person, me, was willing to spend 3 years learning how to use those safeguards effectively. You don't need a trust fund or legal authority to make a difference. You need awareness, courage, and the patience to build credible cases against people who think they're untouchable. Today, Stone Industries employs over 4,000 people in an environment where dignity and respect are foundational values, rather than nice-to-have extras. The company's reputation for ethical leadership has attracted top talent, major contracts, and community partnerships that have made it more successful than it ever was under the old system of family entitlement. Mason, meanwhile, has spent the past 2 years learning lessons that most people master in childhood, that actions have consequences, that treating people badly eventually catches up with you, and that earned respect is more valuable than inherited authority. His trust fund remains frozen pending demonstrated behavioral change, and the Competency Review Board requires annual evidence of ethical conduct before they'll consider any restoration of benefits. So far, Mason hasn't been able to maintain employment for more than 8 months at any position, suggesting that his character issues weren't just family dynamics, but fundamental problems with how he relates to other people. But even Mason's story contains hope for redemption. Change is possible for anyone willing to do the work of examining their behavior, acknowledging harm they've caused, and committing to treating others with basic human dignity. The door isn't permanently closed, it's just requiring proof of genuine transformation rather than superficial promises. As for me, my role as Senior Vice President of Corporate Ethics has expanded beyond Stone Industries. I now consult with other companies that want to build accountability systems for family businesses, and I speak regularly about creating workplace cultures where speaking up is rewarded rather than punished. The work is challenging but deeply satisfying. Every employee protection policy we implement, every reporting system we design, every training program we deliver represents another barrier against the kind of abuse that thrives in darkness and silence. But the most rewarding part of this journey has been hearing from people like you, individuals who've watched this story and recognize their own power to make a difference in their workplaces, their communities, and their families. So let me leave you with this challenge. Look around your own environment. Where do you see people being treated badly by those who have more power? What systems exist that could provide accountability if someone were willing to use them? What documentation could you start gathering if you decided to be the person who says enough? You don't have to be an attorney or have special legal authority to make a difference. You just have to care enough about other people to do the sometimes tedious work of building cases that can't be dismissed or ignored. The power to create change often lies with people who seem powerless, the assistants who overhear conversations, the support staff who witness behavior, the junior employees who see patterns that senior leadership misses. If you're reading this story and thinking, I wish someone would stand up to the bully in my workplace, consider that maybe you're the someone you're waiting for. Document everything. Build your case patiently. Look for allies and institutional support. Choose your timing carefully, and remember that the goal isn't revenge, it's accountability, protection for future victims, and the creation of environments where everyone can thrive. Mason Stone called me just a secretary because he couldn't imagine that someone in my position might have the power to hold him accountable. His failure of imagination became his downfall, but more importantly, it became the foundation for positive change that has affected thousands of people's lives. The next time someone dismisses you because of your job title, your age, your background, or any other factor they think makes you unimportant, remember this story. Remember that real power often lies with people who are underestimated, and that the most effective changemakers are usually the ones who are patient enough to work systematically rather than dramatically. If this story has inspired you, if it's given you ideas about how to address problems in your own environment, please share it. Leave a comment telling me about a time when you witnessed someone face consequences for their own bad behavior. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. And most importantly, remember that you're never as powerless as someone wants you to believe. The tools for creating accountability and protecting others are usually already there, waiting for someone who cares enough to learn how to use them. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about justice, even when it comes quietly and requires patience. And thank you for reminding me that the best stories aren't about revenge, they're about restoration, dignity, and the quiet triumph that comes from doing the right thing at exactly the right moment. The world needs more people who understand their own power and choose to use it wisely. After hearing this story, I hope you'll consider being one of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.